All right, so today we're going to take a look at the difference between bottom-up mixing and top-down mixing. I've always been a pretty staunch traditionalist with mixing, and I've always mixed bottom-up. But there's been a lot of questions asked about top-down, and since I've never really given it a fair shake, I want to go ahead and be open-minded and give it a try and compare two different mixes of the same song, one done the old-fashioned way bottom-up and one done top-down. Is top-down mixing going to actually save me some time, keep me more on track, keep my eyes on the prize, so to speak? Or is it going to be a complete waste of time and turn out to just be a lazy man's half-ass attempt at getting the most decent sound possible without doing all the work? Well, let's find out. So the classic way of mixing would be called bottom-up mixing, where you start with your individual tracks and you process those and work your way up to buses and groups, and you process those and then work your way to the master bus, which would be the last stage in a traditional mix. Now, the idea behind top-down mixing is you would reverse that workflow and you would apply your master bus processing first and then move on to buses and groups and then eventually down to the individual tracks. Now, when I first heard of this concept, I had some of the same questions that I bet a lot of people do, which would be, well, what about things like phase alignment and vocal tuning and drum replacement and really preliminary things that need to happen early on in the mix? And for the sake of this video, we're going to assume that the top-down mixing approach has already done your drum replacement, your vocal tuning, and any phase issues have been addressed. That still leaves some really basic questions about things like high passing and basic low-end processing. So let's get right into the pros and cons of top-down mixing. So from what I hear, the benefits of mixing top-down is that it can save you a lot of time, particularly by focusing on group processing. You might find that you get a good enough result and eliminate a bunch of tedious work that you would have done on the tracks. The argument being that a lot of that can actually be accomplished on the buses or groups, which is an intriguing thought, because if it sped up your workflow and your end result was the same, then that would be awesome. And I have heard people claim that. And another benefit that I've heard is that it keeps your focus on the end result, on the song as a whole, so you're less likely to get bogged down in the weeds and hyper-focused on the details and little elements of a mix, and you keep your eyes on the prize at the finished goal. And that sounds awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And I'd like to think that even mixing from the bottom up, you should maintain that perspective, but maybe that is easier said than done, and maybe there are some benefits from doing it top down. But now the cons of the top down mixing that seem rather obvious at first consideration would be, isn't it actually a waste of time to do it that way? Would it really save time? Or if, for example, you added bus compression without already cleaning up and high passing low end frequencies, if you still needed to do individual track work, wouldn't it undo your bus compression settings? It would seem logical that it would. So that would then be a waste of time. How would that save time? And similar for EQ. If you EQ a bus, but you haven't taken the time to EQ, say, the harshness out of individual tracks, and if you find that you still need to do that, then wouldn't that undo your bus EQ settings? You'd have to go back and adjust those. So the idea that it saves time seems a little counterintuitive, at least depending on the circumstance. And that would all lead me to believe that really this depends on two things. What style of music are you mixing, and what quality of music are you mixing? Now, I have heard people say that when it comes to genres like EDM, that top-down is just not a very sensible approach. And that makes sense to me, since a lot of the signature EDM sounds come from individual track processing. But then there's the question of what quality are you mixing? Now, if you are working with entirely VST instruments, then top-down mixing might make a lot of sense because you're starting with such a refined product. In other words, if the quality of the music on the individual tracks is already so well balanced that you can just skip a lot of those moves and go straight to bus processing, then that makes sense. That would save you a lot of time. But the counter argument to that would be, well, if you're mixing bottom up, why wouldn't you just skip those things that don't need attention and move on to the buses anyway? So I can really see arguments on both sides, but like I said, since I've never really given top-down mixing a fair shake, let's go ahead and get into it. Now, I've been working on this mix off and on for a little while. This is a remake of an old home studio recording that needed a lot of work to get it to sound like a decent mix. And I've mixed it from the bottom up to where it's mostly done, and it has been a real struggle. And I would say this mix is good, but by no means perfect. So let's take a listen to a chorus on this mix.
Right between them eyes. Yeah, I'm gonna put it right between them eyes. Well, I'd rather go blind than see you win. Yes, I'd rather die trying than to let you live. Get your game on.
So it sounds like a top-down approach to a mix like this is going to be a disaster. But I'm going to stay open-minded and I'm going to give it a shot. So what I'm going to do now is copy this project, remove all of the inserts, keep the tuning, the phase alignment, and the drum replacement as is, and then I'm going to clear the master bus and start there from the top down with a clean slate. So you know that feeling in the pit of your stomach when hours and hours of work was suddenly erased because of some technical what have you? Well, I just induced that on myself. All of my effects sends, all my compressors, all my EQs, all of the automation, every single plugin except for the bass guitar I kept split between low and high with these linear phase EQs, but that's it. Everything else is wiped clean. The only other thing I did not undo is the individual track panning. So this sounds more or less like how I started my bottom-up mix. So let's take a listen.
Gonna put it right between them eyes. Yeah, I'm gonna put it right between.
Yeah, absolutely night and day. How depressing to remove all of that work. But if we're going to bother doing it, we're going to do it right. So now we are going to go into the master bus and start applying processing there and work our way down to the individual buses before we touch a single track. And we're going to give this a fair shake and see how it works out. All right, so I'm trying to work quickly here. I just spent 10 minutes on the master bus, and let me show you what I did. I started off with Slick EQ, rolling off 5 dB at 40 hertz. I cleaned up a dB and a half at about 350 hertz, and I took out another dB and a half at 6.2 where it was harsh. Then I added some tape saturation to help beef up the low end and start to glue things together. Then I added some bus compression. And I dialed in my peak versus RMS, and the internal EQ sidechain I ended up going at 177 hertz so it wouldn't overreact to the kick. And I got a good healthy couple dB of gain reduction. Then I brought in a little more saturation targeted between the mids and high frequencies. Then I blended in just a tiny bit of upward compression with the depth knob at 17%. Then I added a hair of stereo width expansion and followed all that up with a little bit of a limiter. So that's my master bus effects chain just to get me started here. So let's go ahead and listen to the original with all of those disabled, and then I'll bring them on.
Gonna put it right between them eyes. Yeah, I'm gonna put it right between them eyes. Well, I'd rather go blind than see you win. Yes, I'd rather die.
And of course, with the master bus processing, it does sound better, but it still sounds atrocious. And I got to say, I'm not too surprised, but I'm staying open-minded and optimistic. So I'm going to go to work on these individual buses, and we'll see what happens. So now I have gone on to the vocals, the kick, the snare, and the bass. I did really quick vocal chains just on the lead vocal, and then I processed the backup vocals all on the bus. And admittedly, it took fewer plugins to get a decent sound because of the processing on the 2 bus, which I guess is the idea of top-down. And then all I threw on the kick bus was limiter 6, doing some compression, limiting, and clipping. And I did something similar on the snare bus to get some compression and harmonics going with the clipper. And on the snare bus, I also added some tape saturation, a little bit of a transient shaper, and followed it up with GSAT doing a little more saturation. On the bass bus, all I've done so far is one multiband compressor, just trying to stay true to the working fast bit here. For the backup vocals, I started off with Slick EQ, rolling off the lows at 150, increased the 700 hertz range, and I added a couple dB of high air at just under 15K because the high air on the lead vocal is more like 12, so that keeps them separated a bit. The lead vocal was a little nasally at 700, so I add a little bit of a hollowed out spot there for the backups. And for the drum bus, which has everything except for the kick and the bass, they have their own buses. All I added was a little saturation and some more multiband compression. But that's essentially it. So I'll go ahead and play you just the vocals, the drums, and the bass with only the 2-bus processing, and then I'll turn everything on that I just did on these buses.
Yeah, I'm gonna put it right between them eyes. Yeah, I'm gonna put it right between them eyes.
Yeah, so you can hear the crunch of the bass and the drums is coming alive. The vocals sound way better once the chains are on them. But I'm doing all of this really quick and minimalistic, so now I'm going to process all of the guitars and the piano and set up some really basic effects sends, and we'll see how it sounds then. And so far, I do have to say that, yes, if you're working top down, you do end up doing less inserts to get a decent sound, but will it be as good as doing it from the bottom up? Only time will tell. So let me hop in and start processing the rest of the buses. All right, so I finished processing all of the buses. I did it all pretty quick and easily. I tried to use plugins that accomplish multiple things at once, like multiband dynamics and doing all the saturation on the buses as opposed to the individual tracks. I have a couple basic EQs on some of the specific tracks. On the piano, I have a multiband dynamics. On the acoustic guitar, I just have an EQ and a multiband compressor. Really basic stuff. I processed the buses fairly minimally, and actually my reverb and delay sends probably got the most amount of plugins on them. Added harmonics and spatial attributes with the effects sends. So trying to do as much on the buses top down as possible. So let's go ahead and take a listen.
Right between them eyes. Well, I'd rather go blind than see you win. Yes, I'd rather die trying than to let you live. Get your game on. Bring it on, bring it on. Right.
So now let's go ahead and do a before and after. Now let's take a listen to the original bottom-up mix, and let's compare that to a really quickly done top-down mix.
Yeah, I'm gonna put it right between them eyes. Well, I'd rather go blind than see you win. Yes, I'd rather die trying than to let you live. Get your game on. Bring it on, bring it on. Right between them eyes. Well, I'd rather go blind than see you win. Yes, I'd rather die trying than to let you live. Get your game on. Get your game on. Bring it on, bring it on. Get your game on. Bring it on, bring it on.
Well, what'd you think? Now, keep in mind the top-down mix has absolutely zero automation on it and hardly any EQ work on the individual tracks. And ultimately, I did it in a fraction of the time as the bottom-up mix. And I was never completely happy with the bottom-up mix. It wasn't exactly finished, but the top-down mix is a surprisingly decent sound for how fast I was able to accomplish it. It's also certainly not perfect, but the point of the experiment was to give it a fair shake and give my 2 cents on it and some takeaways. So here's my conclusion. It was kind of as I expected, trying to do the top-down mix. It still seems to me to be kind of a lazy, rushed way of accomplishing the best sound possible in the least amount of time. But honestly, I was surprised on how decent it sounds and how little processing the individual tracks actually need. So I have to honestly say the top-down approach did work out better than I thought. I did learn some things from doing top-down. So if you haven't tried it, I do think it might be worth a try to see what your personal takeaways are. And I do think I will be adapting a few of my mixing techniques going forward. I still don't think it replaces bottom-up mixing, and I do think a hybrid approach is probably best. Which tells me that personally, my mixing style, I probably have not been moving on to bus processing as soon as I could have. I probably did spend a little too much time on individual tracks and should have just moved on to bus work and approached them both more simultaneously. But that's just me. I just wanted to demonstrate this so you could see what top-down mixing is all about. But let me know what you think in the comments. Do you do bottom-up? Do you do top-down? Do you do a bit of both? I'd love to hear about it, but thanks for checking this out, and I highly encourage you to support the channel over on the Patreon. We have over 2 hours now of question and answers going on over there, and we do another one every week. And I'll leave the links to all that in the description here. In the meantime, happy mixing, and I'll catch y'all on the next one.